Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Hlavev. I'm Artistic Director of BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst in Utrecht. It's my pleasure today to moderate this afternoon conversation. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody from the team here at home. Thank you, Lisbeth, for this invitation. Thank you, Gert-Jan de Vught, Bas Stikkema, and the technical team back there. This is the third and last session of the conference of the European Alliance of Academies, organized under the title, as we all know, but for good order, Contested Histories, Shared Futures. And this panel, for good order again, is titled The War in Ukraine and the Future of European Memory. I'm truly humbled by this opportunity to welcome Vasil Cherepanin, curator and thinker and director of Visual Culture Research Center, VCRC, in Kiev. It's an institution founded in 2008 as a platform for collaboration among academic, artistic, and activist communities. Vasil holds a PhD in philosophy, in aesthetics, and has lectured at a variety of universities and academies, mostly across Europe. Has edited and co-edited various publications and curated multiple projects, including here in the Netherlands, the European International at the Rijksakademie van Beeldende Künste in Amsterdam 2018, and Hybrid Peace at Stroom in The Hague in 2019. VCRC, as many of you know, is also an organizer of the Kiev Biennial, with its latest iteration in 2021 titled Allied, co-organized with East Euro Biennial Alliance, of which VCRC is a founding member. Allow me a few notes on the forehand. Addressing myself to you, Vasil, it is an immense honor to have you with us today. And personally, I greatly value that we in some way continue our conversation. Many conversations from the past, but also the latest one on the Europe Day, 9 May, this year, when we gathered to discuss under the title Solidarity, Culture, Future, all three with exclamation marks. Now, what the Europe Day gathering and today's gathering had in common are many aspects, not the least the notion of Europe as a side of interest to and immense concern and commitment at this very moment, but also mainly and unsurprisingly the focus on the future. However, it is hard to imagine a more contested or more difficult present to work from, a more difficult present from which to engage in this labor of imagining, if you will, but mostly of making that future possible. And yet we must, especially, of course, given the catastrophic war in Ukraine and the unfathomable intensity and scale of destruction it brings for the Ukrainian people, foremost, but also for Europe, the world, and the planet today. The present world, needless to say, that has been already in the state of utter brokenness. The question is whether, in the planetary conditions of accelerating political and environmental violence and deepening divisions that put under pressure the very foundations of the world, and perhaps we will discuss the world order since World War II, the question is whether we can continue to cling to some sort of a fantasy of a possible return to normalcy, whether we can continue to cling to by now defunct institutional ideals and models and practices and forms of life, and whether we can afford to continue inaction in the face of this violence and in the face of the projections of some final victory conjured by the mass necropolitical violence unfolding all around. If the answer is yes to this, I hazard that we are fastened onto a future that is merely the present by another name, a terribly impoverished version of the future. And as we count days of this horrific war of annihilation along the linear modern wartime, I trust to engage today in a conversation around the key question, what more and how must we dare? Now, the last comment that I keep telling myself that neither the idealism of hope nor negativity of despair are necessarily of help to us in these conditions. Instead, I would like to make another proposition, and this really one that I was reminded of when I entered the door here of the Academy, when I came here, because it was some 2 years ago when I articulated it from this very lectern for the first time. And that moment 2 years ago was just about 2 or 3 days before the first pandemic lockdown in the Netherlands. So it must have been February 2020, if I'm not mistaken. That proposition carries on from that thought that neither the idealism of hope nor negativism or negativity of despair is of help at this moment. And I proposed back then, and I think it's interesting to revisit, that what could guide us through this conversation is the notion of disillusionment. And if I use the notion of disillusionment, I do not want to appeal to those negative meanings of the word disillusionment, but something that Rebecca Solnit, feminist scholar and writer, proposed around the year 2020, a positive notion of disillusionment as our capacity to start moving forward without illusions. And with this, I offer the floor to you, Vasil. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. I just would like to ask whether you can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, just to check. So first of all, yeah, thanks so much, Maria, for your very kind introduction. And I would like, first of all, to express my indeed deep thankfulness to Lisbeth and all the organizers of this gathering. I appreciate this opportunity really a lot because I also perceive it as a kind of solidarity gesture, institutionally as well as, of course, politically, not speaking about the personal level, because I actually will be, talking from a multi-dimensional, in a way, perspective, both personal, institutional, because I think it's especially important for me that I can address this European Alliance of Art Academies also on behalf of the East Europe Biennial Alliance that Maria just mentioned. And I think the comparison between both can be also really fruitful. I think we can also leave it to the discussion afterwards. Also, I have to make a kind of a technical note because I'm currently in Kyiv, and I have to warn just in case everybody that it might happen that the anti-raid siren can start off. So in that case, I will have to, for now it seems like it's okay, but if this happens, I will have to pause myself for half a minute and then proceed to the corridor in order to follow the so-called two walls rule for the security reasons. But also in this regard, I also have to, and I think it's not only me, but also all of us have to be also thankful, and I'm really very, very thankful to, first of all, to the Ukrainian military, without which I wouldn't be able to sit here and to have this privilege to talk to you, because I'm still in relatively safe conditions. I have an internet connection, a light in my house here in Kyiv, in spite of constant bombardments. But this is only possible because the guys, basically like me, somehow are keeping the front line, because without that we would have a totally different talk, if any, right? And I think in general the title of today's gathering would be totally different, much more harsh. If in general that would be possible, which I doubt. And in this sense, it's really very important that we have, just referring to the title, that we have these both notions of the war itself, but also the notion of memory, put together also already in the title. I think this is exactly because it's not only about memory politics, right? I have to say from the very beginning, but also, though it of course entails lots of memory politics issues, but at the same time, this is paradoxically exactly about the future, and that is actually the biggest challenge, I think, within the given framework that we all have been violently put in, because if you look at the discursive wrapping of this war, you basically can trace a pretty obvious aspect of it, which is basically when you start with occupying history realm, unavoidably somehow you will end up in occupying territories militarily. And I think that this kind of approach, this kind of ideological approach, which also has a kind of a revenge of memory aspect to it. I think this is basically one of the crucial points, crucial dimensions within this problematic field that I'm going to touch a bit. But it's rather also a kind of a set of points that I would like to make in order to propose a thorough discussion with the audience, because I'm mostly interested also in the outside perspectives on this. But anyways, I think, and also what we can judge from the recent military and political developments, memory has been playing a crucial role as a kind of an ideological wrapping to what has been actually going on the ground. And in this sense, it was a kind of a rhetorical dimension which was kind of providing a proper basis, at least in the eyes of the aggressor, meaning the Russian Federation. Because like if you look also beyond these last 4 months of this full-scale invasion, because as you of course all know, the war itself started 8 years ago, in 2014, as the aftermath of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. But if we look back a bit, we can clearly see that you basically have a kind of a bunch of different instruments that have been weaponized. And all of them have been also aimed at the European Union, but at the idea of Europe as such. So that's why I also think that the problem of that this is exactly the problem of the future of European memory, but also because it's basically Europe which is at stake. So we had these various situations where refugees, energy supplies, various kinds of resources, discourses, media, everything has been weaponized, right? And I think history is also part of this whole endeavor in a way. But at the same time, interestingly, it's this kind of memory discourse, which is implied or included in this war of aggression, has basically, if we look, I'm not a historian myself, but I'm coming from the cultural studies background, but at the same time, it's really interestingly from a kind of a critique of ideology point of view, that this memory discourse, if we analyze it ideologically, has nothing to do with history, right? So this is not about how we remember, but this is rather about how to forget. So this kind of hybridity as part of this memory discourse, I think, is crucial, because what we deal with when we tackle the memory issues here is basically just one side of the coin, which has fear and war as its other side, right? So I think I will also touch this a bit, but I think this is somehow, this can be really well understood within the framework of a general shift to some illusionary past, right? And it's also not by occasion that exactly during these days we can also like observe and watch live the hearings in the US with regards to the January 6th insurgency or a coup attempt, a fascistoid one, right? And I think this idea also, it resembles this idea of make America great again. So I think it's also, I think it was Nietzsche who put it precisely that we are in the situation that what unites us is not what we remember, but what we collectively and together decided to forget. And this is exactly applicable to the warfare developments that we are in. So because this war is basically based on thanatological politics, right? Where even the dead bodies are being weaponized for a special purpose. And in these conditions, paradoxically again, though it's so much concentrated on memory and focused on memory issues, it's basically the genuine memory of the past is the main hostage of this war. And that's, I think, this kind of paradox is also driving the war effort from behind. So what I'm going to do also is basically I will touch a number of issues which I think are relevant to both dimensions, meaning war and memory itself, because there are many ways to describe this war and its connection to the memory realm. But I think what we have really always keep in mind when we hear different proposals with regards to appeasement attempts or possible peace settlement, though of course Ukraine and we are all here. The mostly interested in peace and as soon as possible. But let's not forget that what is really unprecedented about this war, also with regards to the Second World War, which I also elaborated a bit later, but because it's and what was really unexpected, that it turned out that this is a total war, like what in German was called totaler Krieg, right? Because this war appeared to be not the war between the two militaries, right? Two state armies, two regular armies. But this war turned out to be the war of the Russian Federation military against the Ukrainian people, against the civilians, basically mostly, because we have more civilians who died already during this full-scale phase of this war than the military. So, and it's also pretty often is described as the war of aggression, the war of attrition, and so on. But I think that let's not forget, because there is still this kind of a discourse in the West especially, but also in the global public sphere, which somehow consciously or unconsciously, but it presupposes, and still the discursive behavior, so to say, is a kind of attempt to pretend that this is somebody else's war. And I think this is the most problematic point with regards to the topic of our discussion today, which is about Europe and European memory, because we can touch many aspects, but in every respect, this war is actually a European war. And in any respect, in this regard, it is exactly the European war, because this war is about the war on European memory. So whatever aspect you touch here with regards to the, so to say, Europeanness of this, European dimension of this war, is basically always about memory, always, right? So first of all, I think that this war is a European war because it's a counter-revolutionary war. And I mean here that, so basically it's also important in order to place it properly within the European framework, is basically that we are somehow in the situation between the revolution and the war. I think these kind of Hannah Arendt's basic notions are super important in order to understand and to have a general grasp of what is going on the ground, because I mean, when I say counter-revolutionary, I of course mean that this war started as a reactionary, in political sense, as a reactionary response to the Maidan revolution, which took place 8 years ago in Ukraine. And basically, you have to pay attention, even like more broadly, to the very nature of the current Russian Federation regime, which is in its essence is counter-revolutionary, because we can, I mean, the Kremlin can talk a lot and elaborate like about some NATO threats or their claims for with regards to the Ukrainian land and so on, but the alpha and omega, like the actual framework of the current Kremlin regime and its basic intention is actually to prevent any precedent of overthrowing the dictator by the people. So that actually explains why all Russian political opposition at home has been totally smashed, right? That also explains the Russian military invasions into other countries, like not only Ukraine, but it's also about Belarus, about Syria, by the way, Kazakhstan earlier this year in January, right? And so on. And this also somehow, from this point of view, from a point of a counter-revolution, you can also see why there is this kind of absolutely maniacal obsession with Ukraine and with the revolution in Ukraine, with Maidan. It goes much beyond the challenge of democracy as such, if we analyze it strictly ideologically, I would say, because the revolution itself is a kind of a specter, really, to paraphrase the famous manifesto, is really a kind of a specter which has been constantly haunting the current Kremlin regime throughout the last basically 20 years, but especially after the 2008 economic crisis, global economic crisis. And by the way, this counter-revolutionary basis of the Russian Federation regime is basically also explains, if you think about this from another point of view, because it's also, I have to make this point here, because it's also pretty kind of popular and fashionable to make these arguments in the Western public sphere and in the Western discourse in general, that like Putin has this idea to reconstruct the Soviet Union. Let's not, I mean, this is exactly the problem of the European memory, right? Because we don't have to mix things here. Because one thing, when we speak about the Russian Empire, and totally different thing when we speak of the Soviet Union, because basically, if you listen to what the Kremlin regime is saying, they have actually lots of problems with the Soviet heritage. Like in spite what people in the West are thinking about this, because for a very, very simple reason. And it was voiced by the Russian Federation president himself in his famous, or rather infamous, Crimean speech 8 years ago. And this year in February, when he was announcing the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because he was referring to this, and also even it is exactly that's why he accused Lenin in creating modern Ukraine. Because the basic reason here is that the Soviet Union had a revolutionary start. It's actually because of the October Revolution 1917, and which, according to the Kremlin discourse, was just a coup d'etat, right? And that's why, so he can take a lot from the Stalin's rule times, or from Brezhnev times, especially, by the way. I will also touch about this later. But this is also something to be, something to remember here, because it also explains why, in general, we are dealing with the regime in this shape and in the current form, because this kind of degraded form of the Kremlin regime is in itself the result of a kind of a prevented revolution. The revolution which could have happened in Russia if not the political repressions and unbelievable propaganda military machine and military invasions into other countries, because even some illusionary proximity of any revolutionary chance in Russia had been totally smashed. Because it's actually about the fundamental problem in Russia, right? That they have, and which is unsolvable, because this is a problem of the succession of power. This is a basic challenge for the regime, is this transfer of power, because the problem is that you cannot rule forever for obvious reasons. So they are being challenged with this perspective, and they have no way out of this. So this is one of the reasons, basically, that they started the war. And this is also a European war, also because this is a kind of a really unprecedented, in a way, historical reenactment. First of all, of the Second World War, what in the former Soviet Union countries, but also especially in Russia now, is being called the Great Patriotic War. This is the term, by the way, coined by Stalin himself, in order to oppose the Western discourse and the Western narrative about this, the Second World War. So, and here we have this totally unbelievable lexicon, which was used in order to absurdly justify this full-scale invasion. I mean, this discourse about denazification, demilitarization, genocide, and so on. Well, you know, I have to also, to be honest here, I think this is in itself such an unprecedented, unbelievable discursive scandal of a global scale. Because, I mean, I'm sorry, but it's even very hard for me to talk about this. I mean, because to use this language, to use these words is an atrocity itself, right? I mean, this is an atrocity talk. But the scandal is that it's somehow these words are totally debased and deprived of their proper meaning, are now out in the global public discourse, and everybody, I mean, every politician has unavoidably to repeat them in order to oppose them and so on. But this in itself is a total atrocity gesture, right? I mean, my question from the very beginning was basically how the West, Europe, especially the European Union, could accept in general such a discursive framework to use, because this is such a harsh attack on the very basis of the European Union, I mean, and Europe as such. So, I mean, this is also something that we tend to forget when we speak about this, right? Because let's not forget that the discourse is an atrocity today, right? The way it's being justified, but it has also its rationale, right, behind this, because basically what we have here is that in spite of all attempts, the current Russian Federation is ideologically very weak. And basically the myth, the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, right, is basically the only discourse which survived the crash of the Soviet Union, almost intact, without almost any damages. And this discourse was somehow used by the Russian authorities to legitimize their own military dictatorship. And this is, again, a kind of a paradox here, because on the one hand, it's like it's being made out of despair in a way, because there was no other discourse available to justify the current Kremlin rule. And they just used something which, and exactly that's where it comes to Stalin's times, because they used something which was established, by the way, during the 70s, mostly by the Brezhnev rule, as something very powerful. And it was a kind of through the looking glass ideology, let's put it this way, to mirror in a perverse way, to mirror the West, to establish some discourse which claims that this is something that made our one people, that made us one people, like this 20-something million lives put on the as a sacrifice to win the war. And but the problem is basically that actually, and that's basically the biggest ideological distortion of from the Kremlin side, that this discourse of denazification, demilitarization, and so on, that we all know from the 40s and the 50s of the 20th century, has been repurposed in order to legitimize and justify fascistoid dictatorship in Russia itself. And that's basically one of the paradoxes that that we are dealing here now with. And in this sense, that's why it's also a European war, because it exactly is aimed at the dismantlement of the all-European infrastructure, which had been established on the outcomes of the Second World War, right? The idea that Europe is a peace project, and first of all, the most urgent task is to show that where is Europe, there is peace. For that, you have all the institutional framework, all the legal skeleton, right? All the discourse which is wrapping it, so that the European Union, as one of the outcomes, becomes possible, right? So even discursively, depriving these words of their genuine, proper meaning, but also legally as well as institutionally. This is all aimed at debasing the European order, right? Because anyways, because of this unprecedented war, the European continent has had to question its own foundations, obviously. I will also touch about this a bit later, but the attempt of this war and the lexicon which has been used is exactly aimed at these very foundations of the European project as such, right? Also in a very practical manner, because we have already on the occupied territories which have been seized already after the February 24th, these staged trials, and basically the very aim, the very intention of this full-scale invasion was to kind of to conduct a kind of a funhouse mirror image, right? Imitation of what was known as Nuremberg process and the process of actual denazification. So this is really something which has been unseen for decades, right? Because that's why that was on purpose that this war from the Russian side has been stylized and conducted exactly on the Second World War scale. And this is also a European war because it's a fascist genocidal war. And I think this is one of the actually biggest problems for the when we speak about the future of any future of the European memory here, because the problem is actually that in spite of all indications before, the Russian state fascism, which now took the form of open dictatorship, right, military dictatorship. But the problem is that this fascist ideology was dealt before only through what is in German called Wandel durch Handel, right, approach. But the problem is that it has been so much domesticated by the Western capital and the Western political circles that it was somehow uncomfortable to publicly denounce it. And I think this is the biggest threat to the future of European memory, but even to the very present of the European memory. It is it is this the inability, incapability of the West to recognize new fascism. Right, I think it was right. It was Bach, right, Maria, who initiated that project about non-fascist existentia in Europe, right? I think this is exactly what we are. This is the very core of the problem: how to make this non-fascist existentia in Europe possible. Because that's why I'm saying that this is European war and. That the Russian war is aimed at the European foundations, because Europe as such, as we know it today, became possible only on the basis of anti-Nazism. There wouldn't be any Europe possible if the Nazis won the war, right? I mean, it would be another Europe. So it would be it would be Europe, but a totally different one, right? So, but this inability to recognize state fascism, but even fascisms in the EU countries themselves, I think this is something that we have to seriously, I mean, really seriously, if we are not just playing around in comfortable kind of white cubes and discussion places, but something has to be tackled on a very political level, because we basically turned out that we have an openly fascist leader, right, who is like denying the other nation right to exist openly. I mean, it goes just openly with that, and who has also a totally openly fascist propaganda machine, which is issuing like different statements and manifestos, like what should be done with the other nation because it doesn't exist. So it should be like these concentration camps or like filtration camps. That's exactly what they are conducting on the ground, on the occupied territory. And you have an openly fascist state which is ready to execute the representatives of the other of another nation, just because in the fascist leader's mind these people don't have a right to exist, so they have to be exterminated, like literally, which is taking place. And I think that this is also an all-encompassing European problem, because it was exactly the Western financial elites which helped to raise this fascist regime. And it was the Western elites who have been like pumping their money into the Russian, to put it softly, mafia capitalism. But this is much more than that. And also, this is a European war because it's a colonial war. And I think this is just something which is, I mean, this is something which is so much in front of our eyes that we are just not able to grasp it properly. And I think it has to deal with, in general, this is also the general Western, more precisely European problem, that that's the problem that I have with the so-called decolonial trend in the Western countries, right? Because being so much obsessed with this decolonial fashion, let's say, within their own context, the Western countries still are keeping totally a blind eye towards other colonialisms. It's just because they are somehow trapped, you know, in kind of within the framework of the global North and global South. So that's why the West is usually unavailable, incapable to recognize the other colonialism, which is just next to it, which is just close to its nose, so to say, because it is actually, I mean, when we speak about the Eastern European context, right? It complicates this usual binary division of the global North and global South, right? Because East Europe was long regarded as a kind of a semi-periphery in like Wallerstein terms, right? Both from the side of the European metropolis and the Russian metropolis, but at the same time, it went totally unnoticed that a big part of the European continent, the east of this continent, has been experiencing an imperial siege and Russian military occupation. And that is something, I mean, if we speak about colonialism today, I mean, we also have to understand really that, you know, it is exactly the living conditions under direct military occupation that defines the European East and somehow distinguishes it from the current neo-colonial present experiences in the global South. Because,
Vasil,
sorry.
Can I give you 5 minutes and then we hand it over to Maria? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So you know
perfect.
that you... have 5 more minutes, not more.
You have to interrupt me. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, I do.
Yeah, just to wrap up this point, that if you take the current political conditions in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and as well as in the numerous republics which are today part of the Russian Federation, right? You have basically the unbelievable experience of anti-colonial struggles and the occupation attempts of global importance, right? But also, on the other hand, let's not forget that this east of Europe, and Ukraine foremost, was also in the focus of the Western colonialism throughout the 20th century, from the 30s, when this territory was a central target of colonization attempts, both from the side of Moscow and from the side of Berlin, right? This internal so-called colonization of Europe, to the Ostpolitik approach, in which Ukraine just became a kind of an invisible elephant in the room, because it was predominantly addressed to the colonial power in Moscow. And then also in the context of the so-called Eastern Partnership policy, right approach, which was imposed by the EU towards its so-called neighborhoods, in which these post-Soviet East European countries were assigned the role of functioning as basically just borderlands, right? Some gray buffer zones, which somehow foredoomed these neighboring lands for Russian imperial grabs. So in this sense, I think we have to reconsider our approach to colonialism today, also from the side of the West. So to wrap it up, just a final point here is I'm basically here also like following more or less this famous Walter Benjamin's idea that behind every fascism there is a failed revolution. And I think this is also something, the perspective that we have to take and to look from when analyzing the current war and its implications to all European memory, because what we are still in this time frame from 2011, like whatever the context you take, right? The Arab Spring, the Indignados in Europe, Occupy Wall Street, Maidan in Ukraine, Tahrir, Syntagma Square, all these square occupation movements, they were so promising, right? And so aimed at the future, actually. And as a result, they have been substituted, and they remained unrealized and unfulfilled because they have been substituted with military invasions, with wars, and with anti-migrant consensus, with right-wing populist surge in many countries, and so on. So actually, this is a problem that this revolutionary wave had a chance for the future, right? And now it seems that it's only from the framework of the war that we can learn how to get to this future. And the biggest problem is that you have to win the war in order to get there.
That's a good ending, I think, for now, Vasil. Can I interrupt you? Because I think it's good to give it over to Maria and also to the people here. And there's many people from the countries as well that you also mentioned. So there's a lot of shared experiences in that sense. So thank you so far. But there's more to come, probably.
Vasil, hi, Maria again. Thank you so much. So much has been mentioned that it's really hard to understand where to begin. But this conversation, where to begin this conversation. But I think to begin with the beginning, the idea of contested histories and shared futures. You pointed all throughout your presentation to something that I'm experiencing myself continuously, and that's how do we understand history and what do we know? It's somewhat anecdotal, But when I moved to the Netherlands, my first public disagreement was about the question, who won the World War II? And it sounds extraordinarily silly, because we should just know these facts. But indeed, coming from a sphere of influence of former Soviet Union, I learned completely different account of history when it comes to the Second World War. Even a couple of days back, listening to one of the lectures at the context of Berlin Biennial, I listened to the lecture of Jürgen Zimmerer, who articulated World War II as a colonial war. So this was yet another push towards even what I learned, and I kind of thought always I understood what history of Central and Eastern Europe has been. I think you're pointing out something really important, and it's this kind of epistemic failure to understand really what's going on. And I think this is something where it's really extraordinarily important to look at, specifically in our field of artistic and intellectual practices. And as you rightly say, the war happens through discourse as well, in parallel to very unfortunate war on the ground. So I want to come back to the notion of decolonization. And as you rightly said, there's no discussion in the West without bringing decolonization into conversation. The question is how to understand the notion of decolonization at the intersection of what one could call post-colonial constellation, which, as Urkaine Weser, a really hugely important curator in this field, said post-coloniality concerns entire world. It's not just the question of former colonies, it's not the question of former colonizers only, it concerns the entire world. And you could think of a parallel argument of post-communist condition. This happens to be a text by Boris Groys as well, but it articulates the same argument from that other perspective. In other words, post-communist condition does not merely concern countries of former, a sphere of influence of Soviet Union, but it's a condition that concerns the entire world. So my question is, how do we go about this? Because I think neither of these tools alone can help us to understand what's going on. I think we need both post-communist condition and post-colonial constellation together in order to start untangling the histories and the memories as we are discussing. In other words, I think post-colonial theory is simply not enough to understand this. But it's extremely important toolbox at this, in this constellation. So I wonder whether you could speak to this a little bit at the intersection of post-colonial constellation, post-communist condition, because you have done quite significant work, specifically with, of course, VCRC, but also the Kiev Biennial, which is a sort of alliance that tries to kind of deal with this.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is a very complicated and multidimensional, indeed, problematic field, especially if we overlap the discourse of decolonization with the discourse of post-communism. Well, I think that, first of all, it's really what we see with regards to the region that you and I, in a way, coming from, is that basically that this post-coloniality wrapped in a discursive form is just not enough. Because I think it's also perhaps can be explained through the fact that, it originated from the notion of colonialism, which was basically was based on the experiences of West European maritime empires, for which the difference between the colonizer and the colonized was rather about the color of or shade of a skin, right? And I think this is one of the reasons why this discourse overlooked other colonial experiences which were not based on distance as much as it's like when it comes to oceans or some overseas colonies, right? Or when it comes to a different type of racism, which is based not so much on the skin as on kind of a heritage or social implications, or even it can be the same basically skin as in the east of Europe. So, and that's why we have this kind of a paradox, that we have the same Europe, right? Well, of course, it's slightly different because of time and because of technologies and because of general conditions. But essentially, we have more or less the same Europe, the same fascism just coming from the east this time, basically the same territories, even like Ukraine included, the same colonialism, but at the same time, somehow still we have this question, how did it happen that we allowed another fascist war possible on the European continent? And I think, and that's for the post-communist condition. I think this is, as you rightly described, I think it's also one of the examples of an epistemic failure and the failure of perception and of analysis. This is rightly so said that this post-communist condition is not only about the post-communist countries themselves, but about the condition of the whole globe in a way. But at the same time, I think that this kind of perception or this optics which is applied here is basically viewing the Soviet experience as one whole, which is historically a total mistake, and it's totally false, right? Because you don't view.
It comes down to the lack of knowledge and understanding of this history, and I always think
it would be the same. I mean, that is if you would view the whole experience of the 20th century capitalism as one whole, right? It's just impossible. So that's why I think it's too much. We cannot allow ourselves to have these two big generalizations with regards to Soviet Union, and of course it collapsed, and perhaps at that point it was the best thing that could happen. But at the same time, I think we have to differentiate the periods within the Soviet history as much as we differentiate the same periods in all European history. So basically, I think that the biggest problem of overlapping these decolonization and post-communism discourses is about inscribing the experiences of European Soviet East into all European history.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you for this. I think that if I were to derive some task for the field of artistic and intellectual practices for us that emerges from it, it's to act as complexificators of these histories and actually engage in creating knowledges in an accessible way where this complexity doesn't get swept under the carpet of these gigantic gestures. And with that, there is an important task that you already mentioned in your talk, and it's the notion of the vocabularies. You started from the notion of fascism. Of course, when I talk about vocabulary, it's not just innocent word kind of written into a book, but understanding of certain phenomena, such as the notion of fascism. How come we would allow another fascist war? Simply because we thought fascism was a historical phenomena buried in the 20th century. Not understanding that fascism always comes from uncertain futures, right? This is the way how it finds its way in. And then these very ideologically sophisticated games around certain terminology, such as fascism. And you already said that this discourse itself is an atrocity. When the Russian discourse around fascism, denazification, so-called denazification, is actually trying to present another sort of reality. And this is, again, something that we need to really seriously be part of untangling and re-articulating continuously without any delay. And of course, articulating this schizofascism of Russia. This is Timothy Schneider's term, who talks about schizofascism as a Russian ethnic fascism that constantly hurls the accusation of fascism to everybody who disagrees, whether internally or externally within this. Now, I want to touch one thing. In the last few days, you issued an announcement of a forthcoming series called Armed Democracy. It's a series that you curated and will take place at Warsaw Biennial, which is now ongoing, as a contribution or collaboration between VCRC or Kiev Biennial and Warsaw Biennial. Of course, you point out that what is at stake is the world order. Clearly, you refer to the World War II. And you already also stated that how come European Union, born out of the statement "Never Again," actually allowed this to happen again. I don't know whether it's necessary World War II that is being contested on 1989, which probably offers some kind of false promise of the end of imperial paradigm. And I think we are back full on in the imperialist paradigm, and the kind of confrontation of two imperialisms at least, Russian imperialism and Western imperialism. This is complicated debate, specifically from the perspective that you just brought up. I want to bring the notion of alliance into conversation. So I wanted to talk about complexification, as we discussed, and I want to bring the notion of alliance because I'm desperately trying a way how to operate this disillusionment as moving forward without illusions. So as you rightly pointed out, that we're not talking about some sort of exhibition about the war in a white cube. We're in the thick of the real world contestations. The notion of alliance, so alliance or European alliance of academies, East European Alliance of Biennials, the last Kiev Biennial going on under the title of Allied. And I think it's one of really important proposals. So how do we get together to create an alliance against the current conditions? So that kind of collaborative alliance. Two questions I have. One is, in relation to the East European Biennial Alliance, you do something extraordinary, interesting there, because it's allying East European biennials with Global South. So there's a particular challenge, I think, articulate towards Europe. And although I'm fully with you on the discourse of Europe, undoing Eurocentrism is one of the tasks of decolonial practices. So I'm putting complications on the table because I don't know how to square it myself. But I think with this allying of Eastern Europe and Global South, something very interesting is happening. And what it made me think about, speaking about alliances, is the non-aligned movement. The history of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War constellation. So movement of nation states, which is, I think, mistakenly articulated as a movement of those who claim to be radically neutral. I think that's not the case. I think there was an active proposition of discourse and practice of peace, but it was simply refusal to ally with any of the imperialisms, East versus West, vying for dominance. I would want to hear from you whether you see any possibility, any opportunity there for the future constellation of the world, not merely Europe, but shared futures that go beyond kind of reinforcing the Eurocentrism in terms of non-alignment. In other words, what I'm proposing, allying the non-aligned, those who refuse to align with any revived imperialisms.
Oh, right, yeah. so much thankful for this, because it touches so many crucial ideological as well as institutional dimensions. You are totally right with regards to the premises, so to say, of the East Europe Biennial Alliance, because it's basically that's exactly also somehow mirrored in the title itself, right? That's why we called it East Europe Biennial Alliance, not just Eastern European or Central East Europe, you know, like what is usually the outcome, a discursive outcome of this 89 failure of the proposition to end the imperial paradigm, because it's about the alliance of the whole East of Europe. And that's exactly the way, as you presented it, how to undo, in this sense, so-called Eurocentrism. But it's also a funny thing. I mean, that if you think about Europe, it's somehow, it's actual and political, and in terms of politics, in terms of ideology, but even warfare now, its actual real center, genuine center, is in its East. Because when it comes to the West, right, this it's always kind of a cherchez la femme issue. Like this imagined center of Europe is like always present in the West. And by the way, in this regard, we have also experienced this also after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as well as after the crash of the Soviet Union, that the East in this sense has been pretty often used as a pejorative term, just to describe somebody which is rather a kind of a second hand. Because you have you have basically two, in order to tackle Eurocentrism today, you have to start with the fact that as realpolitik reality today, right, is you have basically two Europes. One is polished, civilized, westernized, proper one, and you have a kind of under-civilized, barbaric, with totalitarianism remains, and second-hand Europe in its East, right? And this is exactly, basically, why I totally agree that this 89 promise was totally falsified, because the idea of, though however skeptical we are with regards to the EU, but the very idea of it's not even about the European Union, but about the idea of a united Europe, was basically, and 89 was one of the manifestations of that approach, was basically to overcome the historical division of Europe and political isolation of its East. That is exactly how to tackle the European colonialism today. You have to overcome this, because this is totally unjust conditions, which created a respective political context with when this region becomes basically a battleground for wars, for authoritarian right-wing populism, for hardening of borders, for the vulnerability of civic realm, and so on. So this is the result of this of the European division, because in itself it's a result of European colonialism, or inability to tackle the inner colonialism or internal colonialism in Europe itself. So that's why I think the outcomes of the Second World War are so much important, because that was exactly the one of the last colonial wars in Europe, which luckily failed. So in this sense, I think here comes the alliance idea, right? That you have to kind of to defend some causes which seems like being lost, but at the same time, I think like how to inscribe through discursive, political, but also linguistic means, how to describe these experiences of the Europe's East, which are central to the idea of united Europe and in general to any kind of European future, right? And this is exactly about both post-coloniality, as we talked, and post-communism, so-called, because you cannot neglect it. because the false promise after the crash of the Soviet Union was somehow this kind of, it was vulgarly put it as a kind of an end of history, but it goes much beyond that, because it was somehow perceived that it was a kind of a natural development, that, you know, this catching up the train, the idea, it was Habermas or somebody.
Habermas, catch up modernity,
yeah. This usually from Germany,
yeah.
because they have a, yeah.
Let's open this up. This is really fascinating, and we need a couple of more conferences to deal with it, I'm sure. But I'm sure there are questions towards you from here, from the room. Not yet. Lisbeth, do you have a question?
I was waiting for the colonial aspect of the war, the European war, and in the end it arrived in your talk. And I was wondering why you put it so late to the agenda, because I think it's so. It's also, maybe it's not the first. You know, I don't want to talk in hierarchies, but I think it's so obvious.
Right. Yeah, thanks so much. You're totally right. I'm just, you know, I mean, this is also perhaps a kind of an institutional perspective, because there have been so many things and events and biennials, I mean, international endeavors like organized on colonialism and post-colonialism and decoloniality, that I think it somehow, it has to be addressed when the other contexts had been already put on the table in a way, you know what I mean? In order to approach it properly, not just to have it, you know, lost among so many other issues, which are usually, I mean, now in Europe, decolonial and so on. But you are totally right, and perhaps this is the most, I think, important thing, because here, maybe it's the most important thing I have to say today. That's why I'm here, because it is exactly in this point that we see it's not just some heritage of colonialism, but colonialism per se, it just right now and here as a clear and present danger, right? I mean, the crucial point here is that we basically are now in the situation, and I think it also deals, on the one hand, you have this discourse imposed by the Kremlin that Ukraine is not a nation, it doesn't exist. That's a typical discourse of the Western colonization, right? So it's not because Russia is a different civilization, as they claim. This is just you know, for internal use. This is a part of Europe, and that's why we have the same continuation of colonialism. So we have to understand this clearly. But also, on the other hand, because this is usually what the colonizer says to the colonized, that you don't exist, you have no right, that's why you have to be colonized and occupied. But also, I think the crucial notion here to be addressed is sovereignty. So somehow we are in the situation, and this, I think, is the most dangerous thing for the future of Europe, that almost basically all European countries somehow preliminary, it seems, agreed in principle and accepted that they could get along with it, that a sovereign contemporary state, contemporary nation can be deprived violently from its sovereignty, occupied, and then we can also, I mean, European countries could also have a possibility to re-establish negotiations with the aggressor. So I think that the basic premise here is that we accepted those colonial fundaments on which the European maritime Western European empires had been based for centuries, and which actually were crashed because of the because of the victory in the Second World War, right? because it was actually one of the last colonial wars, as we talked. So, I mean, that the very idea that you can accept that today the country can be deprived of its sovereignty just because the colonizer is claiming that. So it's not. So all these talks about escalation and about nuclear threats and all these kind of nuclear blackmail and so on is just a cover. Because let's not forget that one of the ideas of colonialism is that those colonized are not real. It also means that they don't have a right not only to exist, but that they are deprived of the right of proper self-defense. So this unwillingness to provide even weaponry, which has been stored in Western countries like for years and years, it's also one of the implications of this implicit colonialism. Just because we are not, because Ukraine is deprived of agency, right, of subjectivity. So this is the biggest problem of all European colonialism, that it still agrees that there are some colonized who are deprived of the agency, who are deprived of subjectivity. So those former colonizers can in general agree that the colonized can be occupied. And then if it doesn't happen because of the resistance, of course, everybody perceives it as a miracle. But come on, this is European history for centuries. The colonized do exist, they do have an agency, they do have a subjectivity, and they do resist, because this is exactly how to tackle the European Eurocentrism and European colonialism. There is no other way to overcome it if without resistance, right? I mean, this is all of the history that we all share, from the Dutch Empire, Spaniards, I mean, Portuguese, France, Germany in the Second World, and so on and so on. I mean, Russia now. This is the actual history and our common experience of resisting European colonialism.
Thank you, Vasil.
This is, I think, the most crucial point here.
Wonderful. We have a question, so that's...
Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I have one question. First, thank you, Vasil, for explaining us the Kremlin regime use of the word denazification and how they use the term fascism, accusing all other who don't agree with them. So I want to ask you about the meaning of another term which they use. Is the term which they use when they start the war, I mean, the title, because they don't call it war, they call it special military operation. So when my student asked me in Croatia about this term, I made a comparison with literature. So because this term sounds so surrealistic for me that I said it sounds like Ostap Bender, like from the Golden Calf. You know, when the Ostap Bender is traveling with the train, then he met some political worker from a communist party, and this political worker asked him to create a universal political speech. Then he made this collection, which he called declamatory set of different verbs and expression. So when the Kremlin regime created the title, you know, for me it was sounds very, very surrealistic. So do you have some explanation, or they use this term because of the same colonial idea that Ukraine doesn't exist, Ukrainian doesn't exist, because we have to know that Putin all the time he used the word territory for Ukraine. He never expressed the term state. He never called it state. So can you give some of your input of this term? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question, because it has also this colonial ideological as well as also very practical implications and explanations. Because on the one hand, you are totally right that it is called this way because, you know, it's you cannot you cannot announce a war, because it would mean that you are at war with somebody else. And here is a kind of a continuation that because special military operations are usually, because this is exactly the difference between the regular army service and the kind of special operation services, because it's about the whether it's interior or foreign, right? So in this sense, this idea is a kind of a continuation of this so-called internal colonization claims that we experienced in the 30s and the 40s and then in the 70s of the 20th century, both in the Nazi ideology, for which it was a kind of, because Germany didn't have overseas colonies, so colonies overseas, so it was really obsessed with colonizing, with internal colonization of Europe, right? So that Europe itself becomes a colony. So, but also it was a question and it was a strategy for the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule, especially in the 30s, when it also started, crashed all the achievements of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic in the 20s, right? Like mass killings and repressions and so on. And started this internal colonization within the Soviet Union. But it's always a question, because, you know, to this idea of the internal colonization project, because what is internal and what is external here? Because if you first seize and if you first grab something and then you claim that it's yours, then you can claim that it's an internal colonization, though before it had been external, something external, right? The same with regards to Ukraine. That's why I think it's this kind of language, this discourse is really exploited here. But also I think it has its practical aspect to that, because declaring war, open war, would also have repercussions for the Russian population in terms of open mobilization of people. Because on the one hand, because now, like, we don't have actual polls, right, in Russia at the moment. Those what data that we have, we don't know whether it's correct or not, right? But at least the declaration of an open war would mean that a special martial law and military conditions inside the country. Whereas the current Kremlin regime is rather interested in kind of pacifying the majority of the population that the war is just on the TV screens and it won't touch you personally. But if you declare the war, the state of war as such, it would mean the total reorganization of the whole society. And I think that the leaders of the regime are just are not sure about the consequences and possible disruptions that may occur in case this open declaration of war is being announced. So I think that you have kind of an overlapping of these historical, ideological dimensions with the practical interests in a way.
Thank you, Vasil, for also bringing the internal colonization and neighbor colonization. Because Germany did have overseas colonies, what is today Namibia. Mm-hmm. And actually the first Holocaust of the 20th century, I just learned, happened there between 1904 and 1908. Yeah. And it's part of the colonial amnesia that is upheld by the powers that be, because it's good not to know. And we see all the contestations around Documenta to stay in the field of artistic and discursive practices. I think is the explosion of all these kind of lack of knowledge, colonial amnesia, perhaps epistemic failures, as A.L. Weizmann called it, because we, in the thick of that contestation about the contested histories and figuring the shared futures. I don't know whether there are more questions here. We're also nearly at the end point of this session, how it is announced. I have many more questions that I will bring into our continuous conversation at some other point, but Lisbeth, I think you want to close the session.
Thank you. Yeah, well, if there are no more questions, thank you, Maria, so much for this light moderation. And thank you so much, Vasil, for your elaborate insights on the different, how you call it, types and definitions of war that don't only underline the Ukraine war, but that is, let's say, something that we are seemingly consistently entangled in somehow, and often without knowing or wanting to know. And I think we have to continue to chew on this, no? And I think that also by closing off, I cannot wrap this up with a new, let's say, overarching statement or something, and that's also not my intention. But I think these 2 days that we have been gathered here, and I also thank you for mentioning alliance as something that is maybe a different form, or maybe a form that we can work or maybe change in its meaning, or make it more workable, or make it differently workable. Also thank you for pointing out the non-aligned movement, which is an historical model, of course, but nevertheless, I would say somehow still very much alive, certainly in its potential. So I think we need to keep that in mind. But what I think, if I go back to yesterday with the 2 panels, what I thought was really interesting with the first panel was the question of where's the art in turning around or changing institutions, ripping apart narratives that consistently are contested but nevertheless exist. So that's, I think, a very interesting and urgent one. Today we also talked about the Visegrad group, and I think that has a total parallel with the alliance of the Eastern European Biennial, Eastern Europe Biennial. I have to rephrase that particularly. No, and what I really thought was interesting yesterday, also in the second panel, where different artists, five artists, presented their works and projects and the difficulties that they encountered while doing these, was the immense sense of humor in those projects. And we didn't come to mention this yesterday, but I thought that was actually something that I became sort of aware of throughout. And I thought, like, perhaps one of the, but one of the best ways to resist or to overcome, let's say, despotism or whatever it's called in its different forms and shapes, is maybe the laugh and the humor. Also the laugh, by the way, as Charles mentioned. But also, I would say, the laughter as something that can sort of perhaps tackle. And that's a hopeful ending, but I don't know what else to say. And maybe one more thing. I think that we cannot end definitely with this. I mean, we will end this today, but for the next stages of the alliance of European academies, I think what we have discussed in Madrid, the power of art, what we have discussed these 2 days here, I think will definitely feed into how we move on and how we hopefully continue to move on. So thank you very much all for your attention, and thank you, Vasil and Maria, for your very skillful and great moderation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasil.
Thank you so much.